allowed. Okay. I'm just going to be going over 8.4 homework. Okay, so I guess let's just start with one. I mean, there really aren't a whole lot of questions, so I can kind of just like knock this out one by one. So the first one, at least for me, I think it should be pretty similar. They give you x is equal to -3 sine t, and then y is equal to -3 cosine t. And they say t is greater than equal to 0, which really doesn't matter. But they just want you to find an equation for this. Okay. And this is a multiple choice question, like this question is specific, because like the first ones in the homework are always like some conceptual multiple choice one. So this is pretty much the same concept as the 8.2 homeworks, kinda, except that we're dealing with terms in T and A. But in reality, T just replaces theta and A replaces R, but they mean the exact same thing. So I forget what this is, the parametric equations, that's what they're called. So technically, because like how we have in polar form as x is equal to r cosine theta and y is equal to r sine theta. This is pretty much the same thing, except x is equal to a cosine theta and y is equal to a sine theta. And it's the same thing because the equation they want you, like they tell you it's like x squared plus y squared is equal to something. And like normally we have like r squared, but instead it's really just the same thing except it's a squared. So the ones of a's are for parametric, and for who just joined, I'm just going over the 8.4 homework for now at least. So with this equation, you can kind of make the correlation. Obviously, there is a 3, which would be the equivalent to a in this case. So if you plug that into the x squared plus y squared, you would get -3 squared, which is just x squared plus y squared is equal to 9. And then that would be the answer for the first question. And the reason why I knew to use x squared plus y squared is because all the multiple choice questions have x squared plus y squared in it. That's the only reason why I knew that. Does that make sense? It's like the same equations, they just replace a couple letters, but they mean the same thing practically. So, going into the actual meat of the questions that would probably be on your test are the ones with like the graphs. So number 2 gives x equals 2t, and y is equal to t plus 6. So, hold on, I need to take a sip of water. So there are 2 parts to this question, and I actually think solving part B first is easier because part B is really what you would want to use to solve for part A, at least in my opinion. So I don't know why they make part B second. I think it's more important to do part B first, so I'm going to do part B first. With that being said, so part B says find a rectangular coordinate equation for the curve by eliminating the parameter. And that's kind of a bit of a mumbo jumbo just for we want an equation. So we're not going to use any of these specific equations that we have. What we're going to do, we want it in terms of x and y because it's rectangular coordinates. So we want it in terms of x and y. So we're going to use substitution for what they give us. So if we want to get something in terms of x and y, and they gave us x equals 2t and y is equal to t plus 6, we want to get something in terms of t equals, because if we get something that is t equals, we can substitute that into one of the equations, and then t will no longer exist. So I'll show you what I mean by that. And it doesn't matter if you choose x, if you choose x or if you choose y to do the manipulating for, to get like t equals, doesn't matter. In this case, I'm going to use y is equal to t plus 6 to get something that's t equals, because all you would have to do is subtract 6 from both sides. So you would get y minus 6 is equal to t. Because we have y minus 6 is equal to t, we're going to plug, and this is important, that because we did it to this, we messed around with this, we're going to substitute t into this equation. Hi. Okay. We're just going over 8.4. So, 8.4. Okay. I was just going through the homework. So this is just question 2. We haven't gone very far. Okay. So, does that make sense? Because I'm just going to substitute t in. So, since t is equal to y minus 6, I'm just going to put y minus 6 where t was. And then you get x is equal to 2y minus 12. And then I'm just going to get this in terms of y equals something, because all these lines, well, all these graphs are lines, and usually lines are in like slope form. Y equals mx plus b. So I'm just going to add 12 to either side, right? And then I'm going to divide 2, x divided by 2, and then 12 divided by 2 is 6. And then that'll be equal to y. And then this would be your equation for part B. And then we'll do part B, or sorry, we'll do part A with part B. Does this make sense how I got this equation? Okay. Does this make sense to you? I know you came in late. Okay. So we want to pick our equation here. This is kind of just typical like graphing skills from this is just a slope line. So obviously x over 2 is the slope. Well, let me rewrite it like this. This is usually how it's written. And so plus 6 just means that there will be the intercept on the y-axis is going to be at 6. So out of all these graphs, and the slope is positive. So, a positive slope line goes like that. And you want an intersection at 6 because that's what the b is for this. So the graph would be the one that looks, they don't give specific points, but you want it to be going through 6. So it'll look something like that. You just want it to intercept at the 6. And then this would be the graph that you would pick. That's why I think part B, I don't know why you would do part A first. I don't know why they want you to do part A first. I find doing part B easier to find the answer for part A. The part A is just picking the graph. But usually the graph is based off of the equation that you have to solve for part B. So there's a lot of people on Zoom. Does anyone have any questions about what I did? Okay. I think everyone's good. Hopefully. Okay. So let me do let me skip ahead to 4 just because that's a little bit different. 3 on the homework is pretty much exactly the same, except that they want t to be greater than 0. And all that means is that you shouldn't have the line of your graph going anywhere below 0. And that's on the y-axis. T is like equivalent to like the y coordinates. So that's all that means. So they just make sure it doesn't go below the half of the graph when it says t is greater than or equal to 0. Okay. Let me do 4. So you have x is equal to t squared, and then they give you y is equal to t minus 2, and then 2, and then they give you this range. Okay. So once again, I'm gonna do part B first to find the rectangular coordinates. And so this time, yeah, this time I'm still gonna do the y one. Well, no, I'm gonna do the one with x because if we just wanted to get it in terms of x equals, and like I'm saying, this really does not matter. You can pick to mess with x equals, you can pick to mess with y equals, it doesn't matter which one you pick. I'm just gonna do this one because all I have to do is square it. So then I'll get the square root of x is equal to t. And then because I have something t equals, I can substitute it into the y equals t minus 2. And then that's a little less work because then you just have y equals the square root of x minus 2. So I'm just substituting t in. And then we get a rectangular equation because it doesn't have t in it. It's just made of x and y. And I'll just make sure it checks, or make sure this one works just for the sake. It should. I'll just make sure just in case. Yes, okay. So that'll be the equation for part B. Is this good for everyone? Up here. When I plugged it into, because it was y equals t minus 2, and t is just equal to square root of x, so all I had to do was just put square root of x there, and then we kept the minus 2. Okay, so we're then picking the graph. Oh, actually, there's another part to part B. It says where blank x is that. All they want you to do here is oh, yes. If you look back up at the beginning where x is equal to t squared, so if we just want to, because it's going off of this range right here, the 2 is less than or equal to t, which is less than or equal to 4. So if x is equal to t squared, and we want this range in terms of x, and this is t up here, we're just going to square 2, so 4, and we're going to square 4, which is 16, if that makes sense. That's really all you'll do for this one. And it's almost, I will say, like on the exam, these questions, like especially these graph questions, are pretty copy paste. Like The only thing that'll change are like the numbers. But as far as the like this part goes for part B, like if you get this question, it'll almost always be x is equal to t squared, and then you just square the values in the original range. So you'll be fine with that. So this is the new range, and that's just a range for the graph in rectangular coordinates. And if we want to plot the graph, honestly, I would just plug in a value for x and then just see which graph matches it. Like in this case, all the graphs have like a different starting point. Like one starts at 0, one starts at 4, one starts at -4, which I can already tell you doesn't work because if you like you can say x is equal to -4, but if you plug that into this equation, you're gonna get imaginary numbers, and that's already not gonna work. So yeah, basically. So like the correct answer is gonna look like this. It'll be the graph that looks like this. And you don't have to really about the curve, they're all curved. And that's just because like if you plugged in, I clicked off, like, right, because obviously 4 is the x coordinate. You plugged in 4, square root of 4 is 2, 2 minus 2 is 0, which then makes sense because this coordinate is 4, 0. So this is the only right graph. I would just plug in an x value and see which one matches. That's the best way to figure out what the graph is. Does everyone go with that? I swear these are like slightly more intimidating than how they seem. Anyone have questions? Okay. And I'll just say for the people on Zoom, like I know I'm recording this, but if you put anything in chat, the recording's not going to see you, what you put in chat. So don't worry about that if that's why if you don't want to say anything because of the recording. Yeah, I can do that. I'll get to that. I just want to do a couple more questions on here because there's not that many. And then, like, a lot of them are pretty similar. I'll probably do like 2 more questions from these. Yeah, I'll do like 2 more from 8.4. There's not a lot of questions. Okay. So 5, if my pen will write. So this one gives you x is equal to 2t plus 1, and then y is equal to t plus, if you let me write, 1/2 squared. So to find the equation for this, I'm still going to try and get something to t equals so we can substitute it in. I will be doing this with the x equals because that is considerably easier to just get t alone. So I'll subtract the 1 to get x minus 1 is equal to t, or 2t, and then just divide it by 2. So then we get t is equal to x over 2 minus 1/2. But to get the equation into rectangular coordinates, we still have to plug t back into here. So this will be a little messier, but so if we plug in for t, we have x minus 2 minus 1/2 plus 1/2 squared. So obviously negative 1/2 plus 1/2 is going to equal to 0. So these two will cancel out more or less because it'll just equal 0. And that'll leave us with y is equal to x over 2 squared, which then you can square this if you want. That'll just be x squared over 4. Because when you square a fraction, you square the top and the bottom. So this will be your equation for b. And then we're just going to pick the graph. So this will be a parabola because of the x squared. And when x is positive, it's an open parabola. So for one, you'll know that you want to have an open parabola or upwards parabola. And then what are the differences? I would do the same thing as the last one. I would just plug in an x value and see if it matches. For this, I would plug in, I think I want to plug in -4 or 4. It doesn't matter. These graphs are very, like the graphs I'm looking at are very close together, but one has a much longer range. One has a much shorter range of like y values or x values. So I'm just gonna plug in 4. If you have the homework up, you'll know what I mean. But like the two graphs look pretty similar, but it's the x-axis that differs. So if I were to plug in 4, you would get 16 over 4, which isn't 4. So you would want to like find 4 on the x-axis and then like, you know, like move your cursor up and it should line up with about 4 on the y-axis. So you can try and draw the graph. It would be something like if this was 4, like that would be 4. It would look something like that. That's about as good as a graph I can draw for that one. But if you're always unsure, just start plugging in numbers and seeing what works, what matches. Okay. That's so funny. Okay. I'm gonna do one of the like the word problem. Not really word problems. But like 7 and 8. So I'll do 8. So 8 says the line with slope -2 passing through -25 and -15. And I'm not gonna lie, I don't know how she solves this in the notes, but there is a pattern to this. These will all be pretty similar in the answers. So, slope. I'm gonna put -2 over 1 because technically everything can be written over 1. The reason why I do that is because technically slope is the change in y. That's what the triangle means, is change. The change in y over the change in x. So, because they want you to write an equation or coordinates, I guess. This is what they give you. They want something that's equal. They want coordinates. So technically -2 will be the change in y, and technically 1 is the change in x. So obviously 25 is our x coordinate. -15 is our y coordinate. So how these problems will always be structured is you'll always put t, and then depending on what like the change in y and the change in x is. So for x, because obviously the first part, this part, it's just going to be t because the change in x is just 1. So you're just going to leave it as t. And then it'll be minus 15, minus 25 because the coordinate is negative 25. If it was positive 25, it would be t plus 25. And then you do comma, and then since the change in y is negative 2, it'll just be negative 2t minus 15. And then that's the trend. It'll always be exactly like this. And then this is the answer. Like this is the answer to the question. This is supposed to be a parentheses. This is how these problems will always go. I'll do another one. So like, and I'll keep this one up so you can kind of see. So like for the second one, they give you a slope of 1/2 and it passes through 1, comma, -3. So since this is already a fraction, it's already, so 1 is the change in y, and then 2 is going to be the change in x. So for doing x, so because 2 is a change in x, it's going to be 2t, and then since our x coordinate is 1, it's going to be plus 1, and then comma, and since our change in y is just 1, you can just put t, and then the y coordinate is -3, so it'd be -3, and then that's your answer. If you can remember, just that slope is y over x, and then just, like, it'll always be t plus or minus, like, the x coordinate, and then, like, comma t plus or minus the y coordinate, depending on if the coordinate is positive or negative. And then you might have to put a number in front of t, but that's really the extent of these questions. Does that make sense? Like, it won't change up on you. Like, I would solve these questions the exact way every time. There's not gonna be like a variation in that. And that's really 8.4. That's about it. For which question? Okay. Ew. Okay. So 6 I give you as x is equal to cosine. Let me write cosine squared t, and then y is equal to sine squared t. So I believe what they want you to do is go back. Okay. Do you remember this Pythagorean theorem? That's basically what they want you to do. And there's not really like much substitution I don't think you need to do. I think as long as you can recognize, and I mean, you can really do whatever you want. I mean, you can take like x plus y. And then because, like, if you take this x and add it to this y, technically you would get, right, you would get this equation. Like, I wouldn't try and find t for this one just because it's like in terms of cosine squared and sine squared. But this is, oh my gosh. This is technically the answer. This is the equation they want. X plus y is equal to 1. Just because it's just going back to this Pythagorean theorem. That's really all they want for that one. And then they give you a range, and the range will just be from, this will be the range, 0 to 1. And then just pick a graph. To be honest, there's only one graph that fits that range, which is the one that's in the only quadrant 1. Because if the range is 0 to 1, then. But that's just like, if this question pops up on your test, I would imagine that it would look exactly like this. Like I can't see them like varying up this question. Because then it wouldn't be, then you couldn't do the Pythagorean theorem, sine squared plus cosine squared. So if this is on your exam, like this should be, no promises, but this should be exactly how it is. Okay. I'm gonna go to 8.1. People are asking. This kind of works because one person wanted to do an example from 8.1, and then someone gave me a bunch of questions from 8.1, so that works. So, best of both worlds. Okay. 8.1. But yeah, that was basically all of 8.4 for you guys, more or less. So, I'm gonna go. Okay. I'll start with number 10 from 8.1. Homework. Okay. I will say sometimes my numbers are a little bit different, but they should generally be the same vibe. Yeah, so they should be. Okay. So at least my number 10 is this. Is 7 negative 7 pi over 6. So, and they want you to graph the point. So 7 is going to be the radius, and negative 7 pi over 6 is going to be theta. So this one will be pretty simple in terms of the radius is positive. So we like when the radius is positive, because when the radius is positive, we don't have to, all you'll have to do is just plot this angle in a quadrant, and then that'll be your answer when the radius is positive. So that's simpler. But of course, this is a negative 7 pi over 6. So when we're dealing with negative angles, they go clockwise around the unit circle. It's supposed to be negative. So technically it would look, this is, usually pi over 2 is on top, but when it's negative, it goes the other way around. So I always just like to make my basis pi. I find comparing things to pi tend to make things easier. So I'm going to make it have a denominator of 6, just because that's what negative 7 pi over 6 is in. So technically, negative pi is equal to negative 6 pi over 6. So because angles, and technically they're decreasing, but the numerator gets bigger as they go this way around the unit circle. So like the numerator will be increasing in that direction because it's going clockwise. So if negative pi is negative 6 pi over 6, and we have negative 7 pi over 6, that's only technically a pi over 6 increase. So it will fall within, oops, I erased my line. It'll fall within this quadrant. This would be where negative 7 pi over 6 is. It's technically in the second quadrant. And then because your radius is positive, your answer will be a dot in the second quadrant. Does that work for everybody? Maybe, hopefully. I'm gonna assume that makes sense. And I'll explain what I mean with the negative radius. Okay, cool. Okay. 18. Am I 19 at least negative? No. Let me see what the other questions are for this. 35. And okay, none of these questions that at least the homework gave me have a negative radius, but I guess I'll do it both ways around just for sake of doing it. Okay, so my 18 is 4 comma 9 pi over 4. So, well, these questions are weird. I hate how they draw the graph like this. They draw it like an X. Like, draw it like this. You guys know what I'm talking about. I'm sure you do. I don't know why they draw it like that. It's still going off of a normal unit circle. They just didn't include the y-axis for some reason. Technically, the y-axis would be right in the middle of this, and the lines are just that like angles in the quadrant, in each quadrant. Okay, so because our radius is positive, we're not gonna have, all you have to do is just find what quadrant 9 pi over 4 is in. And so in this case, I mean, pi is still going to be here. This will be 2 pi. So still be pi over 2. Still be 3 pi over 2. So I know I say I usually compare things to pi, but in this case, it'll be easier to compare it to 2 pi because if you change, if you want 2 pi to have a denominator of 4, because that's what our angle is in, right? You would take 2 pi and times it by 4 on the top and bottom, and that would get you 8 pi over 4. So 2 pi is equivalent to 8 pi over 4. And so when angles are positive, they increase this way around. And so if 2 pi is 8 pi over 4, then 9 pi over 4 is just pi over 4 more than 8 pi over 4. So it would be in the second quadrant. And they put a 4 here and they like put a dot and they like label it P, I think. P would be the answer in this case. Just because angles increase, meaning that 9 pi over 4 would be in the first quadrant. And that would be your answer. Good. Is everyone on Zoom good with that? You good with that? Okay. Oh, and let me demonstrate if this was negative, just for the sake of if it was like -4. So let's say for funsies, this was -4, 9 pi over 4. So this, I mean, a radius is just a point from the origin to the edge of a circle. Assume that there's a circle around here. And so technically the radius should always be positive because it's a measure of distance, technically. So technically r should always be positive. However, like in this case, our r is negative because it's -4. All that means is that a negative r is just the opposite of r. So like if negative r was here, then r will be here. It's just basically they're just in opposite, they're in like diagonal quadrants of one another, which is also pi away. That's also what opposite means. Opposite just means an angle plus pi. So let's say for fun, we had -4, 9 pi over 4. So assuming what we did in the beginning, I would still want you to solve it the exact same way and find where 9 pi over 4 is in. So 9 pi over 4 would still fall in this quadrant, the first quadrant, but the problem is that this would be the negative radius. So if you want to make it positive, just go in the opposite direction. So technically, and I'll draw the answer with a red dot, your answer would be in quadrant 3, not quadrant 1. So if you ever have a negative radius, still find the angle and then just go to the diagonal quadrant of wherever the original angle lies, and then that will be your answer. That makes sense? I know that confuses people. But you just have to remember that the radius and negative radius are just opposites of one another. They're just in diagonal quadrants. Yeah. Yeah, I was just taking from what we did up here and just shortcutting it down here. But yeah, still find the angle first and then just go to the diagonal quadrant. I mean, technically, that's what I could do. I mean, if you wanted to, you could like subtract pi or add pi to 9 pi over 4 and then find the quadrant in which that angle is in. It doesn't really matter which way you do it. I just like to do it this way just because they give you it. Because if you somehow mess up adding pi to 9 pi over 4, then your answer is more likely, I guess, to be wrong. So I'd say it's safer that way, but it doesn't matter. You'll get the same product answer. Okay. There's no objections. I'm going to do a similar question to this. Okay. So this one is for -15 pi over 4. So I guess the trickiest part about this question is just determining where -15 pi over 4 is in. So same thing. Well, actually. So we have -15 pi over 4. For the sake of not trying to add up the axis points and figuring out where -15 is, I'm just going to find the coterminal angle for this. And finding coterminal angles is just adding 2 pi or subtracting 2 pi. And I'll usually do that until I get an answer between 0 and 2 pi, just because that's usually the unit circle we work in, and I think it's easier to recognize that. So in this case, because 15 pi over 4 is negative, I'm going to add 2 pi. Yeah, so I'm just going to add 2 pi, which I'll bring this down here. 15 pi over 4, and then if we remember, 2 pi is the equivalent to 8 pi over 4, and sometimes you have to do this more than once. In this case, you'll have to. So -7 pi over 4, and technically this is between -2 pi and 0. So if you wanted to find where this is, that's totally doable. But for the sake of getting it positive, I'm just going to add another 2 pi to it. So another 8 pi over 4. And that'll get me pi over 4. And I think pi over 4 is a lot easier to find what quadrant that lies in because it's a reference angle. It's between 0 and pi over 2. So pi over 4 will fall in the fifth quadrant. And so your answer would be, technically this is one of the ones. It's like, oh, and technically your answer is P for this question. And that's because negative 15 pi over 4 and pi over 4, they are equivalent to one another. Like if you do sine of negative 15 pi over 4 and sine of pi over 4, they're going to get you the exact same answer. So that's why doing that works. So answer is P. First quadrant is where this angle will be in. And because the radius is positive, we don't have to mess with it. So I asked 35. Unless someone has a question on that, I'm going to move on. You good on this? Okay. Okay. I'll do 35, which is theta is equal to negative 5 pi over 2, and they want you to make this into rectangular coordinates. So the way I would do this question personally, how I find doing this question easiest, is just thinking about it a bit more conceptually. Honestly, the fact that it's negative 5 pi isn't really relevant. It's more of just realizing that the angle is over 2. The reason why I say that is because if you notice, there is a pattern that the y-axis angles are in terms of over 2. So if you ever have an angle that's over 2, it's going to be on the y-axis somewhere. Doesn't really matter if it's on the top or bottom for this question. It's just important that you know that it falls on the y-axis somewhere. So because of that, obviously rectangular coordinates are in terms of x or y. And so in this case, it's kind of an algebra-y, but x equals something will always be a vertical line. Y equals something will always be horizontal line, because like if you have x equals 1, you would go to like 1 on the x-axis, and then that's a vertical line. Doesn't make sense for it to be horizontal, because that means x equals 1, x equals 2. Like if x equals was a horizontal line, then all the lines would be exactly the same. So that's why they're vertical, because then they're all different. Because like x equals 2 is then it's parallel to x equals 1. So that same concept, y equals some things are horizontal lines. If you go to 1 on the y-axis, it'll be a horizontal line at the y-coordinate 1. So if 5 pi over 2 is an angle on the y-axis, and the y-axis is a vertical line, then you can just say that x is equal to 0, because if you were to graph x equals 0, and I'll draw it in red, it'll just be a horizontal line, or sorry, a vertical line at the origin, which is the y-axis. And then the same thought process goes if it's like theta equals pi or something, it would just be y equals 0. If theta equals pi or something. So that's the concept for that. Anyone have any questions on that? Good. Okay. 39. Okay. 39. Assuming that no one has questions on this. So 39 is like the trickiest one. I don't even know why they bother, to be honest. Okay. So it's r equals 4 cosine theta, and they want it in rectangular coordinates, which means they just want it in terms of x and y and or both. And so usually with these type of problems, we want to, like, we'll just take one of the equations we have and then just like substitute it. But in this case, there is no equation that fits any of these because I'll show you the ones that matter for this one. Oh my gosh, what am I doing? X squared. Because we know we have r, but like our only equation has like r by itself is r squared. Similar to that, we have an equation that has cosine theta, but it is x equals r cosine theta. In this case, there's no r on this right half of the equation. So if you notice, there's a trend. So on the left half, we have r, and if we had r squared, we could easily substitute something in. Same thing on the right side. If we had r cosine theta, then we could substitute x in. So our way to combat this issue is to just multiply r on either side of the equation. I mean, because you can multiply whatever you want, as long as you just do it to the left and right side of the equation, you're totally in means to do whatever you want. So we do r times r on the right side, and for cosine theta times r, then we would get r squared is equal to, and I'm just going to write it like this so it's easier to see, 4r cosine theta. Yeah, that's that. Okay. And then using these two equations in specific, you will just substitute them in because we want it only in terms of x or y. We don't want r or theta in here. So that gets you x squared plus y squared is equal to 4x. And then did I do that right? Yeah. I forget how I did this in class, right? Did I just like subtract or no? I know this is right. How did I? I know I did it differently. And I don't remember how I did this. Hold on. Hold on. Oh no, I remember what I did. I remember what I did. I just subtracted the 4x. I just subtracted the 4x from either side and just equaled it to 0. I forgot if I like divided one or the other. No. This is an acceptable answer. I just made it. I just put everything on one side. And I'll double check. That should be right. I like blinked there for a second. Oh my gosh, the Wi-Fi is so slow. Please. Okay, yeah, this is right. I don't know why I blinked there for a second. But you can just subtract the 4x and just get everything on one side, and they'll take that as an answer. And then this is an acceptable answer. If it's sine, like if this was sine, you're just going to end up substituting y in instead of x. Okay. I'm officially out of questions that people gave me. I could probably do like one more if you're like quick with it. But if anyone else has any other questions, ask now. Otherwise, I would say this is it. This is all I was going to do. Okay. I think everyone's fine. Hopefully. No problem. Everyone's all good. I'm just gonna end it. Do you have any questions? Are you good? Okay. Okay. All right. Well, everyone have a nice day. And 4 minutes early. But goodbye.